crowd is getting restless. What do you see? They're pressing forward. Something's happening down there. We need to be ready. I see movement near the front. Stay sharp. Agreed. Let's move closer to the edge.
Imagine for a moment that it is July 11th, 1968, and you are standing on the corner of Lenox Avenue in the heart of Harlem. The air is thick with the scent of lilies and a heavy, suffocating sense of grief that you can feel in your chest. For 12 blocks in every direction, the most famous black neighborhood in the world has come to a complete and total standstill. The buses have been rerouted, the store owners have locked their doors out of respect, and thousands of people are packed onto the sidewalks so tightly that some have climbed fire escapes just to see over the wall of bodies. But if you look up at the rooftops, you will see something that doesn't fit a typical funeral. Plainclothes police officers are crouching behind ledges with shotguns, scanning the crowd through binoculars. They are not there to mourn the man in the bronze casket. They are there because they are terrified. They know that for 30 years, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was the only thing holding the fragile piece of Harlem together. Every detective in every precinct and every Italian mobster in every back room in Lower Manhattan understood that the moment Bumpy Johnson was lowered into the ground, the streets would begin to bleed. This is the story of what happened next. This is the story of the deadliest stretch in Harlem's modern history, the massive power war that erupted when the man they called the Godfather was gone, and why 40 men paid for his death with their own lives. This is the story of what happens when the one person holding everything together finally lets go. But to understand any of that, you have to go back, way back, because Bumpy Johnson was not built in a day, and neither was the empire he left behind. Ellsworth Mayme Johnson was born on October 31st, 1905, in Charleston, South Carolina. His parents named him Ellsworth, but the kids on the street gave him the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life. They called him Bumpy because of the large knot on the back of his skull, a physical quirk he was born with that made him look like he had already survived something before he was old enough to walk. In a way, that was exactly right. Bumpy Johnson was born into a world that was designed to break him. And instead of breaking, he became something that world had never quite seen before. His childhood in Charleston was not easy. The Johnson family was poor, and the South in the early 1900s was not a place where a black child's intelligence was celebrated or cultivated. But Bumpy was different from the start. He read voraciously. He studied history, philosophy, and poetry. His older sister Mabel saw the fire in him and made the decision that changed everything. In 1919, when Bumpy was around 14 years old, Mabel brought him north to New York City, specifically to Harlem, which at that time was in the middle of the greatest cultural explosion in African American history. The Harlem Renaissance was in full bloom. Jazz was pouring out of every window. Langston Hughes was writing, Marcus Garvey was marching. And a 14-year-old boy with a bump on the back of his head and a fury in his chest was about to absorb all of it. Harlem changed Bumpy Johnson, but the streets changed him faster than any book could. By the time he was a teenager, he was already running with crews, already learning the economics of the underground. He had a gift for math, for strategy, and for reading people. He could tell in 30 seconds whether someone was trustworthy or whether they were about to make a move against him. That gift kept him alive in a world where most young men with his ambition and his temperament ended up dead before 30. By the 1930s, Bumpy Johnson was one of the most feared and respected men in Harlem. He had spent time in Sing Sing. He had been in more fights than most men would see in 10 lifetimes, and he had built a reputation as someone who could not be intimidated. But what set him apart from the average street enforcer was his mind. Bumpy Johnson could negotiate. He could sit at a table, read the room, understand what every person at that table wanted, and find a deal that kept everyone alive long enough to walk away. That skill was about to become the most important thing he had. Because in 1935, everything in Harlem was about to change. To understand the 1935 crisis, you have to understand what Harlem looked like in the early part of that decade. Prohibition had ended in 1933, and the Italian organized crime families who had made fortunes from bootleg liquor were now looking for new streams of income. The numbers game, which was an illegal lottery that had been running in Harlem for decades, was the most lucrative operation in the neighborhood. It was run almost exclusively by black entrepreneurs, men and women who had built entire networks from the ground up, in employing runners and collectors and managers and paying out winnings in a system that was more reliable than most legal banks. The most powerful of all the numbers operators in Harlem at that time was a woman named Stephanie St. Clair, known on the street as Madame Queen or Queenie. She was French Caribbean, sharp as a blade, and she had built an operation that generated hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. She was not someone who was going to hand anything over without a fight. But she was also smart enough to know that when Dutch Schultz, one of the most violent white gangsters in the city's history, decided he wanted a piece of the Harlem numbers game, the fight was not going to be a fair one. Schultz moved into Harlem like a storm. He used intimidation, bribery, and outright violence to muscle in on the numbers operations. And the black operators who had built those businesses from scratch were suddenly forced to watch their own work stolen from them. Stephanie St. Clair tried to resist. She took out ads in newspapers calling out the police corruption that was enabling Schultz. She was brave and she was brilliant, but she needed muscle. And that was where Bumpy Johnson came in. Bumpy Johnson became Stephanie St. Clair's enforcer, the man who stood between her and the men Schultz sent to collect. This put Bumpy in direct physical conflict with the most dangerous white criminal organization in the city. And what happened over the next few years turned Bumpy Johnson into a legend. Men who went after Stephanie St. Clair on behalf of Dutch Schultz had a habit of ending up in the hospital or in the ground. Bumpy Johnson was ferocious in a way that could not be quantified or prepared for. He was relentless. He was also smart enough to know that, eventually, the math of this fight would not work in their favor. You can win every individual confrontation and still lose the war if the other side has infinite resources and yours do not. Then something happened that nobody predicted. In 1935, Dutch Schultz was murdered by the Italian mafia at the Palace Chop House in Newark, New Jersey. The man who had terrorized Harlem was suddenly gone. But the Italian families, specifically the Luciano crime family led by Lucky Luciano, still wanted a piece of what Harlem was generating. They had a choice. They could try to take it by force, which would mean a long, expensive, and bloody war with a neighborhood that had already proven it was willing to fight, or they could negotiate. Lucky Luciano chose to negotiate. And the man he sat across the table from was Bumpy Johnson. What came out of that meeting was an arrangement that would define Harlem's underground economy for the next 30 years. The Italian mafia would receive a percentage of the profits from the Harlem numbers operation, and later the narcotics trade in exchange for staying out of Harlem's day-to-day operations. Bumpy Johnson would run the neighborhood. He would be the gatekeeper. Nobody came uptown without his knowledge, and nobody moved product without his approval. It was a deal that gave the Italians their money and gave Harlem something far more valuable, a measure of self-determination in a city that had never offered black people any at all. This arrangement was not without its costs. Bumpy Johnson was arrested repeatedly over the decades, spending time in federal penitentiaries, including Alcatraz, where he became, by all accounts, one of the most well-read inmates in the facility's history. He read philosophy. He wrote poetry. He studied law and economics. And then he came home and ran the streets with the same meticulous discipline he applied to everything else. The man was a walking contradiction, and Harlem loved him for it. To understand the world Bumpy Johnson built, you have to walk the streets with him for a minute. You have to understand what Harlem looked like in the 1950s and 1960s. Because without that context, the collapse that followed his death makes no sense. Harlem in that era was a community under severe economic stress. Redlining had made it nearly impossible for black families to access the kind of mortgage financing that was building white suburbs all across America. Job discrimination meant that many Harlem residents were locked out of the factory jobs and professional careers that were producing the post-war American middle class. The neighborhood's physical infrastructure was deteriorating. Schools were underfunded. Police brutality was rampant. And the federal government, which was pouring billions of dollars into the Highway Act and the GI Bill for white Americans, was offering almost nothing to the people of Harlem. In that environment, the underground economy was not a fringe operation. It was, for many families, the central economic engine of the neighborhood. The numbers game provided jobs for thousands of people as runners, as collectors, as managers, as accountants. The social clubs that served as fronts for gambling operations were also community gathering spaces where business was conducted and disputes were settled. And at the very top of all of it was Bumpy Johnson, who understood his role in a way that no simple criminal could. Bumpy Johnson gave out money. This is documented extensively by people who knew him. He would walk down 125th Street and hand out cash to people he knew were struggling. He funded funerals for families who couldn't afford them. He made sure that the older residents of the neighborhood, the grandmothers and the elderly men who had lived in Harlem for decades, were treated with respect. Every Thanksgiving, he organized food distributions. Every Christmas, there were gifts for children in the neighborhood. He was, us in the truest sense of the word, functioning as a social safety net in a neighborhood that the American government had decided did not deserve one. Now, before we go any further, I want to be very clear about something, because this part matters. Bumpy Johnson was not a saint. He was a criminal who controlled the trade of substances that destroyed families. He was a man who used violence to maintain his power. The people who ran numbers under his authority were running an operation that extracted money from the poorest people in the neighborhood through gambling. The romanticism around Bumpy Johnson exists in tension with the reality of what organized crime does to a community. And we have to hold both of those truths at the same time. But the reason his death mattered so much, the reason 40 men died after his funeral, it was not because Bumpy Johnson was a hero. It was because the system he had built, for all its flaws, was a system. It had rules. It had a hierarchy. It had consequences for those who broke the rules. And when he was gone, all of that disappeared overnight. By the mid-1960s, Bumpy Johnson was already an old man by the standards of his world. He had survived Alcatraz, survived multiple attempts on his life, survived decades of incarceration, and survived the kind of political and physical pressure that would have broken most men in half. He was diabetic, and his heart was not good. He had spent so much time in federal custody over the years that his body had absorbed punishment that it could not simply shake off. But he was still Bumpy Johnson. He still walked the streets of Harlem with the same slow, only deliberate authority he had always carried. He still sat at his booth at Wells Restaurant on 7th Avenue, still held court with the old-timers, still made the calls that settled disputes before they became something worse. His wife, Mayme, whom he had married in 1948, was his anchor. She was a sharp, dignified woman who had managed to build a life alongside one of the most complicated men in New York City's history without losing herself in the process. In the spring of 1968, the world around Bumpy Johnson was changing at a speed that even he was struggling to keep up with. The civil rights movement had transformed the political landscape of Black America. The assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in April of that year had sent shockwaves through Harlem so powerful that riots broke out in cities across the country. In Harlem, Bumpy Johnson was one of the people who physically walked the streets trying to calm the anger, trying to prevent the neighborhood from burning itself down in grief and rage. By some accounts, the actual mayor of New York City, John Lindsay, who was trying to do the same thing across the rest of the city, was less effective in Harlem than Bumpy Johnson was. That tells you everything you need to know about the kind of authority this man carried, not just in the criminal world, but in the community itself. But the political transformation of Black America in the late 1960s was also creating pressure on the old order that Bumpy Johnson represented. A new generation of young men in Harlem was coming up, and many of them did not have the same respect for the hierarchies that the previous generation had maintained. When they had grown up watching civil rights activists challenge authority, watching young men fight back against systems that had oppressed them, and they were applying that same defiant energy to the streets. The old rules. The idea that you did not make a move without going through the right channels, without getting the blessing of the man at the top, were starting to feel outdated to the ambitious young operators who were looking at the drug trade and seeing unlimited opportunity. Bumpy Johnson could feel the ground shifting under him. People who knew him in his last years say that he was worried, not afraid. Bumpy Johnson was not a man who showed fear, but was concerned. He knew that the new generation of young men coming up in Harlem was not going to follow the same code he had enforced for 30 years. He knew that the heroin trade, which had been growing steadily since the late 1950s, was becoming so large and so profitable that it was attracting a level of ambition and violence that even he would have difficulty controlling. And then, on the night of July 7th, 1968, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson sat down at his favorite booth at Wells' restaurant, ordered a chicken leg and some grits and coffee, and his heart gave out. He was 62 years old. He died at the table. The news spread through Harlem before the police had even finished their report. By the following morning, everyone knew. The reaction was immediate, and it was enormous. People wept openly on the streets. Older women who had known Bumpy Johnson for decades stood in doorways with their hands over their mouths. His death was announced on the radio, covered in the newspapers, and discussed in every barbershop, every beauty salon, and every corner store in the neighborhood. Wells' restaurant, where he had spent so many late nights, became a kind of informal memorial where people came to stand and remember and try to process the fact that the man was actually gone. His funeral, 4 days later, was one of the most remarkable public events in Harlem's history. More than 2,000 people gathered to pay their respects. The processional stretched for 12 city blocks. Mayme Johnson, his widow, received condolences from people representing every level of Harlem society, from politicians to preachers to street operators who had worked under Bumpy's authority for years. The floral arrangements filled the church. The music was extraordinary. People who had spent decades on opposite sides of various disputes came together in that church and stood side by side, united for the first time in a long time by the simple fact of loss. And on the rooftops above all of it, the police officers with their binoculars and their shotguns watched the crowd and waited. Because they already knew what was coming. The New York City Police Department's Intelligence Division had been monitoring Harlem's criminal landscape for years, and they understood the structure of the operation that Bumpy Johnson had maintained. They knew that his death was not just the end of a man, it was the end of a system. And they knew that the dozens of men who had been operating within that system, men who had been waiting patiently, following the rules, taking their cut without making a power move, were about to start calculating whether now was the moment to strike. They were right. The first signs appeared within days. There were arguments in rooms that had been quiet for years. Men who had operated alongside each other for decades without incident were suddenly looking at each other sideways, recalculating who owed what to whom and who had the strength to collect. The corner operations that Bumpy Johnson had carefully parceled out to various crews based on relationships and track records were suddenly vulnerable. If a crew was running a corner under an arrangement that Bumpy Johnson had personally blessed, that blessing was now meaningless because the man who had issued it was in the ground. What made this particular power vacuum uniquely dangerous was the commodity at the center of it. The numbers game, which Bumpy Johnson had built his early reputation on, was declining in relevance. By the late 1960s, New York State had introduced its own lottery, which was eating into the margins of the illegal numbers operations. But heroin was booming. Heroin was the product that was generating millions of dollars a year in Harlem, and the distribution of that product had been structured, at least partially, by the hierarchies that Bumpy Johnson maintained. With those hierarchies gone, the heroin trade in Harlem became something very close to an open market. And when you have a product worth millions of dollars and no governing structure to regulate who can sell it and where, you get violence. Simple, brutal, inevitable violence. The pattern that emerged in the weeks and months after Bumpy Johnson's funeral was not one large war between two organized factions. It was something much messier and therefore much harder to stop. It was dozens of smaller conflicts happening simultaneously, each one overlapping with the others, each one generating its own chain of revenge and counter-revenge. A dealer would be shot for moving onto a block that belonged to someone else. The shooter would then be found dead in his car a week later. The men who arranged that retribution would find their supply line cut off by someone who saw an opportunity in their distraction. And on it went. A cascading series of confrontations that the police, despite all their intelligence gathering, had no framework for controlling. By the end of 1968, from barely 6 months after Bumpy Johnson's funeral, law enforcement estimates placed the number of drug-related homicides in Harlem at a level that was unprecedented for peacetime in that neighborhood. The bodies were turning up in stairwells and on rooftops and in cars parked on side streets. Young men who had been alive and operating in the spring were dead before Thanksgiving. 40 men. That is the number that law enforcement and journalists who covered the period would attach to the first 2 years after Bumpy Johnson's death. 40 men dead in drug-related violence in a neighborhood that, under Bumpy Johnson's watch, had maintained a level of organized discipline that kept this kind of mass casualty event from happening. The number is almost certainly an undercount, because not every killing was obviously drug-related, and many victims of this period were people whose deaths were not investigated with any particular urgency by a police department that had spent decades viewing Harlem as a problem to be managed rather than a community to be protected. Now, into this chaos stepped 2 men who would define the next chapter of Harlem's story. And they were as different from each other as it was possible to be while still operating in the same world. The first was Frank Lucas. Frank Lucas was born in 1930 in LaGrange, North Carolina, and arrived in New York City as a teenager with virtually nothing. He was ambitious in the way that only someone who has come from absolute poverty can be, with a hunger for power and resources that was never fully satisfied, no matter how much he accumulated. By his own account, which it should be noted his critics have disputed extensively, he met Bumpy Johnson in the early 1950s and became a close associate over the following decade and a half. Lucas would later tell anyone who would listen that he was Bumpy Johnson's right-hand man, his driver, his confidant, the person who understood his thinking better than anyone else alive. Mayme Johnson, Bumpy's widow, had a different story. She described Frank Lucas as, essentially, a peripheral figure. Someone who was around, who performed errands, who was never in the inner circle in the way that Lucas claimed. She had no patience for the mythology that Lucas built around himself in the years after Bumpy Johnson's death, and she said so publicly and directly on multiple occasions. The truth, as it almost always does, probably lives somewhere between those two accounts. Lucas was almost certainly more connected to Bumpy Johnson than a complete outsider, and almost certainly less central than he claimed to be. What is not disputed is what Frank Lucas did after Bumpy Johnson died. He moved fast, and he moved smart. Lucas understood that the existing supply chains for heroin in Harlem, the connections that ran through the Italian mafia to sources in Southeast Asia via European distributors, were inefficient and expensive. Every time the product changed hands between suppliers, the price went up and the quality went down by the time it reached the street. The men who controlled those supply chains were making money at every step, and the product that reached Harlem streets was often cut so many times that it was a fraction of its original potency. Lucas had a different idea. Through connections he had developed, partly through his relationship with American soldiers returning from Vietnam, Lucas found a way to source heroin directly from Southeast Asia, specifically from the Golden Triangle region of Southeast Asia, bypassing all the intermediaries who had been taking their cut for decades. The product he brought to market was extraordinarily potent compared to what the neighborhood had been accustomed to. He called it blue magic. He sold it for less than his competitors, and because it was so much stronger than what people were used to, it created a level of dependency in users that was unlike anything Harlem had previously seen. The scale of what Lucas built in the early 1970s was staggering. At the peak of his operation, by his own account, he was generating as much as $1 million a day. He employed family members from North Carolina to manage various parts of the distribution network. He was not just a dealer. He was a logistics operation. He was, in the language of business, vertically integrated. And because he had no Bumpy Johnson to answer to, no governing authority above him in the Harlem hierarchy, he was free to expand without limit. He moved into territories that would previously have required negotiation and approval. He underpriced competitors who had been operating in their areas for years. He was not building a structured system as the one Bumpy Johnson had maintained. He was flooding the market, and the flood was drowning the neighborhood. The second major figure to emerge from the post-Bumpy vacuum was a man named Leroy Nikki Barnes. If Frank Lucas was a force of raw economic disruption, Nikki Barnes was something more deliberate and in some ways more sophisticated. Barnes was born in Harlem in 1933 and had grown up in the streets of the neighborhood during the era of Bumpy Johnson's dominance. He had been arrested multiple times and had spent time in prison, where he studied the structure of the Italian mafia with the same intensity that a business school student might study a successful corporation. What Barnes understood was that the chaotic, every-man-for-himself scramble that followed Bumpy Johnson's death was not just violent, it was inefficient. Businesses run on cooperation and on shared infrastructure. The Italian mafia had been successful for decades, in part because they had a structure, a hierarchy of bosses, underbosses, and captains that gave everyone in the organization a clear role, a clear set of responsibilities, and a clear set of expectations about what they could and could not do. Barnes wanted to build that structure for Harlem's narcotics trade. And so, in the early 1970s, he assembled a group of 7 powerful drug operators in Harlem and proposed something that had never been done before in the neighborhood. He called them together and presented the idea of a council. Not a takeover, not a single kingpin dominating everyone else, but a cooperative structure in which 7 men would share resources, share distribution, share legal protection, and divide territories in a way that eliminated the constant friction that was getting everyone killed. The council was, by any objective measure, an extraordinary piece of criminal organization. In each of the 7 members maintained autonomy over their own operations while contributing to the shared infrastructure of the whole. They pooled resources to hire lawyers, to pay bail for members who were arrested, and to manage supply chains collectively. They agreed on prices, which stabilized the market and eliminated the price wars that were generating so much violence. They divided Harlem into zones of operation that each member controlled without interference from the others. For a brief period in the early to mid-1970s, the council actually worked. The level of random, chaotic violence that had defined the immediate post-Bumpy period decreased, not because the drug trade was getting smaller. In fact, it was getting much larger. But because the structure imposed by the council was giving operators a framework to resolve disputes without immediately reaching for a weapon. But there was a fundamental problem with the council that Nikki Barnes and his associates never fully addressed. Bumpy Johnson's authority had rested on something that the council could not replicate. Bumpy Johnson's authority rested on 30 years of personal reputation, on the specific relationships he had built with the Italian mafia, and on the fact that even his enemies acknowledged that his word was unbreakable. The council was a committee, and committees do not have the moral authority of a man who has spent 30 years proving who he is. As the 1970s progressed, the council began to fracture from internal pressures. Members began to cheat on the shared arrangements. Jealousies developed. Trust eroded. And without the bedrock of genuine personal trust, the entire structure was vulnerable. When law enforcement began to systematically target the council's members in the mid to late 1970s, the organization did not hold together. It fell apart. And Nikki Barnes, who had built the whole thing, was eventually convicted and sentenced to life in prison, a sentence he would later reduce by cooperating with federal investigators, which made him one of the most controversial figures in Harlem's history among the people who had worked alongside him. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to the immediate aftermath of Bumpy Johnson's death and talk about the human cost of what was happening, because the statistics, the 40 murders, the millions of dollars in product, the organizational structures that rose and fell, all of those things can make you forget that we are talking about real people in a real neighborhood. Harlem in the late 1960s and early 1970s was a community in genuine crisis. The drug trade that expanded so dramatically after Bumpy Johnson's death was not filling warehouses in some abstract economic zone. It was moving through the streets where families lived. It was reaching into the apartments where children were doing homework. The people who were dying in doorways and in cars were young men from those families, men who had brothers and sisters and mothers who would carry the weight of those losses for the rest of their lives. The heroin that Frank Lucas brought to market with his direct supply chain was, because of its extraordinary potency, creating addictions in people who had tried the drug in its more diluted form and thought they had some control over their use. The product Lucas was selling was not the same product. Users who had built up what they thought was a tolerance were caught completely unprepared. Overdoses spiked. Emergency rooms in Harlem and in East Harlem, which had their own parallel crisis with a Puerto Rican community equally ravaged by the same trade, were overwhelmed. The police response to all of this was a complicated and often ugly story of its own. The New York City Police Department in the late 1960s and early 1970s was an institution riddled with corruption, some of which was directly linked to the drug trade. The Knapp Commission, which was a formal investigation into police corruption that ran from 1970 to 1972, revealed that officers throughout the department were on the payroll of narcotics dealers, accepting bribes to look the other way, to warn dealers of upcoming raids, or simply to leave evidence at crime scenes unprocessed. Some of the most significant barriers to law enforcement action against the drug trade in Harlem during this period were not the criminals themselves, but the officers who had been paid to protect them. This context matters because it explains why, in the years immediately following Bumpy Johnson's death, the police presence in Harlem felt to many residents less like protection and more like occupation. Officers who were known to be taking money from dealers would nonetheless conduct aggressive stop-and-frisk operations against young men on the street. Once they would arrest low-level users and runners while the operators who were paying them continued working. The community's relationship with law enforcement, which had never been warm, became actively hostile during this period in a way that made it nearly impossible for ordinary residents to get meaningful help when they needed it. and the ordinary residents of Harlem needed help desperately. The parents who were watching their children come home from school and get pulled toward the street economy needed resources and support that the city was not providing. The families who had lost men to violence needed grief counseling and legal assistance that was not being offered. The community organizations that were trying to hold the neighborhood together, the churches, the social clubs, the barbershops and beauty salons that had always served as informal civic infrastructure, were operating without any meaningful government support in the middle of a crisis that was destroying the fabric of the neighborhood. One of the most painful aspects of this entire period is that the conditions that made Bumpy Johnson a necessary figure in the first place, the economic abandonment, the redlining, the job discrimination, the political neglect, were not only unchanged by his death, but in many ways were getting worse. The Model Cities programs that Lyndon Johnson had promised were being slowly defunded as the cost of the Vietnam War consumed the federal budget. Richard Nixon, who took office in January 1969, 6 months after Bumpy Johnson's funeral. He was not a president with any particular interest in the welfare of communities like Harlem. In fact, Nixon's approach to the drug crisis would add a new layer of devastation to what was already happening. Nixon declared what he called a war on drugs in 1971. In principle, a serious federal effort to address the narcotics crisis should have been good news for a neighborhood like Harlem, which was drowning in heroin. In practice, the war on drugs was applied in ways that devastated communities of color while leaving the underlying economic conditions untouched. The mandatory minimum sentencing laws that began to emerge from this era sent young black men from Harlem to federal prisons for decades for relatively small-scale drug offenses. While the architects of the trade, the men moving product at the wholesale level, often escaped through corruption and cooperation agreements. The young men who were going to prison during this period were coming home years later into a neighborhood that had not gotten better. They had criminal records that made legal employment nearly impossible. They came back into communities that were even more deeply immersed in the drug economy than when they had left. And the cycle continued. There is a name that deserves more attention in this story than it usually gets, and that name is Mayme Johnson. Mayme Hatcher Johnson married Bumpy Johnson in 1948 after a relationship that had begun years earlier while Bumpy was incarcerated. She was a woman of extraordinary dignity and intelligence, who spent 2 decades managing a life that most people could not have endured for 2 weeks. She navigated the social complexities of being the wife of the most powerful criminal in Harlem, with a grace that was remarked upon by everyone who knew her. She maintained friendships with artists, intellectuals, and politicians. She kept her own counsel. And when Bumpy Johnson died, she was left to manage his legacy in a world that was suddenly and violently changing. What Mayme Johnson understood about her husband, perhaps better than anyone else, was his complexity. She knew that the romanticized version of Bumpy Johnson that the streets celebrated was not the complete picture. She knew that the man she loved was capable of extraordinary tenderness and intellectual depth. The Bumpy who wrote poetry and quoted philosophers, and also capable of a controlled savagery when the situation demanded it. She did not sanitize him in the interviews she gave later in her life. But she also refused to let the narrative of his life be reduced to a simple morality tale. In her memoir, written decades later, Mayme Johnson spoke about the years immediately following Bumpy's death with a clarity that is heartbreaking. She described watching the neighborhood change in real time, watching the structures that Bumpy had spent his life building come apart piece by piece, watching young men who might have operated within a disciplined hierarchy under Bumpy's watch go to war with each other over corners and supply lines that suddenly had no legitimate arbitrator. She described the grief of knowing that her husband had spent 30 years preventing exactly what was now happening, and that within months of his death, all of that prevention was undone. She also spoke about the visits she received in the years after Bumpy died. Men who had worked in and around his organization would come to see her, sometimes to pay respects, sometimes to ask for advice, sometimes to ask her to mediate disputes that they had previously brought to Bumpy himself. She did what she could, but she was clear-eyed about the limits of her position. The authority that Bumpy Johnson had carried was not transferable. It was his, built over decades through specific relationships and specific demonstrations of his character. Without the man himself, the authority simply did not exist. Let's talk about a dimension of this story that is easy to miss if you are focused only on the criminal dynamics, and that is the political dimension. In the late 1960s, Harlem was not just a neighborhood in the grip of a criminal power struggle. It was also one of the most politically energized communities in America. The civil rights movement had created a generation of politically conscious young Black Americans who were organizing, advocating, and demanding change in a way that was unprecedented. In Harlem specifically, figures like Representative Adam Clayton Powell Jr. had been demonstrating for years that Black political power was a real and achievable thing. Community organizations were mobilizing around issues of housing, education, police accountability, and economic development. The explosion of drug-related violence that followed Bumpy Johnson's death landed in the middle of this political moment like a bomb. It gave ammunition to those who wanted to portray Harlem as inherently dangerous and ungovernable, a place that needed more policing rather than more investment. It made it harder for community organizers to make the case for economic development when the headlines about the neighborhood were dominated by murder and narcotics. It gave elected officials cover for continued neglect by pointing to the violence as proof that the neighborhood's problems were self-generated rather than structurally imposed. At the same time, many of the most vocal critics of the drug trade in Harlem were also the people most likely to be targeted by law enforcement in ways that were not directly related to drugs. The Black Panther Party, which had a chapter in Harlem, was under active federal surveillance and harassment through the FBI's COINTELPRO program, which targeted Black radical organizations with a range of tactics that included infiltration, disinformation, and active disruption. Community leaders who were trying to address the drug crisis through organizing and advocacy were having their communications monitored and their activities disrupted by a federal government that apparently viewed their organizing as a greater threat than the heroin that was killing their neighbors. This is one of the most bitter ironies of the post-Bumpy period. The moment when Harlem most needed coherent political and community leadership to fill the vacuum left by the collapse of the criminal hierarchy was exactly the moment when that political and community leadership was being most aggressively attacked by the federal government. The community was being hit from both sides simultaneously, by the violence and the drugs from within, and by the surveillance and disruption from without. By 1971, 3 years after Bumpy Johnson's funeral, the landscape of Harlem had been transformed in ways that would have been almost unrecognizable to the man who had governed those streets for 30 years. The Italian mafia, which had maintained its relationship with Harlem's narcotics trade through the structure that Bumpy Johnson had negotiated, was adapting to the new reality of multiple competing Black operators while continuing to supply product through its own supply chains. Frank Lucas's operation was at or near its peak, moving product through a network that stretched across the borough, while Nikki Barnes's council was becoming an increasingly organized force that was working to bring some order back to the chaos. And the federal government was beginning to pay serious attention. The DEA, which was formally established by Nixon in 1973, was building cases against the major narcotics operators in Harlem with a methodical intensity that would eventually bring the entire structure down. The agents working these cases understood that they were dealing with sophisticated operations and that building airtight cases would take years. They were right. Frank Lucas would not be arrested until 1975. Nikki Barnes would not be convicted until 1978. But the process of building those cases was already underway in the early 1970s, and the pressure it was generating was adding yet another layer of instability to a world that was already spinning. When operators knew that federal investigators were circling, it changed their behavior. Trust became even harder to maintain. Paranoia, which in a world of criminal enterprise is never far from the surface, escalated. Men who suspected they were being watched began to move against associates they thought might be cooperating with authorities, which generated more violence. Men who were actually cooperating with authorities sometimes used that relationship to eliminate competitors, which generated even more violence. The neighborhood was caught in a cycle that had no clean exit. The drug trade was making too much money for the operators to walk away from voluntarily. The violence that came with the trade was eroding the social fabric of the community in ways that made it harder to organize against the trade. The law enforcement response was removing individuals from the trade while doing nothing about the economic conditions that were generating recruits for those positions at a rate that outpaced the arrests. This is the moment in the story where it becomes important to sit with the complexity of what we are describing. Because the easy narrative, the one where Bumpy Johnson was a good man who maintained order and his successors were bad men who destroyed it, is not quite right. The reality is that the system Bumpy Johnson built was itself deeply harmful to the community he claimed to serve. The numbers game extracted money from people who could not afford to lose it. The latter narcotics trade, even when run under the disciplined structure of Bumpy's hierarchy, was flooding the neighborhood with a substance that was destroying lives. The order Bumpy Johnson maintained was an order built on exploitation. What collapsed after his death was not a benevolent institution. What collapsed was a management structure. And the 40 men who died in the years following his funeral were casualties not of the loss of that management structure alone, but of the underlying conditions, the poverty, the racism, the economic exclusion, the lack of legal opportunity that had made that management structure necessary in the first place. Bumpy Johnson did not create those conditions. He operated within them, and in doing so, he simultaneously protected some people from the worst of the violence and ensured that others suffered from the trade he controlled. Now I want to tell you about a specific moment that captures something essential about this entire period, and it centers on a decision that law enforcement made in 1977 that changed everything. By 1977, Nikki Barnes had become so prominent, so openly wealthy, and so apparently untouchable that he did something that was either extraordinarily bold or extraordinarily reckless, depending on your perspective. He appeared on the cover of the New York Times magazine in a full-color photograph, dressed in expensive designer clothes, looking directly at the camera with an expression of absolute confidence. The headline referred to him as Mr. Untouchable. It was a provocation. President Jimmy Carter personally saw the article and directed the Department of Justice to focus resources on bringing Barnes down. The resulting prosecution was massive in its scope, involving extensive wiretaps, informants, and financial analysis that built a RICO case against Barnes and 6 of his associates on the council. In 1978, after a trial that was itself a major public event, Nikki Barnes was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The message to Harlem's criminal world was stark and clear. The structure that had tried to fill the vacuum left by Bumpy Johnson was gone. Its leader was in federal prison for life, and the street-level chaos that had marked the immediate post-Bumpy years, which the council had managed to partially suppress, came roaring back. But this time, no, the landscape was different in a way that made the coming chaos even more destructive than what had come before. The late 1970s saw the beginning of a crack cocaine epidemic that was still several years away from its peak, but was already beginning to change the economics of the drug trade in fundamental ways. Crack, which would arrive in full force in the mid-1980s, would be even more addictive than heroin, even cheaper to produce and distribute, and even more devastatingly effective at destroying communities. The infrastructure of the narcotics trade that had been built in Harlem during the decade following Bumpy Johnson's death would provide the distribution networks and the street-level organization that the crack epidemic would run through when it finally arrived. The 40 deaths that followed Bumpy Johnson's funeral were not the end of the story. They were the beginning of a much longer and much more devastating chapter that would unfold over the next 2 decades. But those 40 deaths, in that specific 2-year window, represent something important. They are the precise moment when Harlem lost the structural buffer that had held back the worst possibilities of the drug trade. And the community felt the full consequences of that loss for the first time. There is something we need to talk about that most documentaries and most books about this period do not spend enough time on, and it is this. What did ordinary Harlem residents, the people who were not in the drug trade, not in law enforcement, not in politics, but simply living their lives in the neighborhood, what did they actually think about all of this? The answer is more complicated than the narrative of victimhood that is often applied to communities like Harlem during periods of crisis. Because Harlem was not a monolith. It was a community of hundreds of thousands of people with different opinions, different experiences, and different relationships to the world that Bumpy Johnson had built and the world that was collapsing after his death. Some people genuinely mourned Bumpy Johnson, not as a criminal, but as a community figure who had done real things for real people, and whose presence they felt had made the neighborhood safer in certain specific ways. These were often older residents who remembered when the Italian mafia had been trying to take Harlem by force, and who understood what it meant to have had someone like Bumpy Johnson sitting across the table from Lucky Luciano. They had a historical memory of what the neighborhood had been before Bumpy Johnson and what it might have been without him. Other people had a much more complicated or even hostile view of the world Bumpy Johnson represented. Young men and women who had grown up watching neighbors and family members fall into addiction. Mothers who had buried sons. Fathers who had spent years trying to keep their children away from the corners. These people did not necessarily weep for the loss of Bumpy Johnson's order, because that order had never protected them in the ways that mattered most. And their grief was not for the end of the criminal hierarchy. It was the ongoing grief of living in a neighborhood that was being systematically destroyed by forces that no one seemed to be effectively fighting. And then there were the people in the middle. The teachers and the preachers and the barbers and the community organizers who understood that Harlem's problems were real and structural, and that no individual, no matter how powerful, was ever going to solve them. These were the people who were quietly doing the unglamorous work of holding the community together, who were running after-school programs and food pantries and community boards, while the criminal world and the law enforcement world fought their parallel battles above and around them. They understood, perhaps better than anyone else, that the question of who controlled the drug trade in Harlem was the wrong question. The right question was why the conditions existed that made the drug trade so powerful in the first place. As we come toward the end of this story, I want to bring it back to the specific weight of what we have been discussing, because it is easy in a story this large and this complex to lose sight of the individual lives it contains. 40 men. 40 individual men who were alive in the spring and summer of 1968 and who were dead by 1970. Each of them was someone's son. Many of them were someone's father, someone's brother, someone's friend. Some of them were predatory criminals who had caused real harm to real people. Some of them were young men who had been drawn into the world of the street economy because legal alternatives were scarce or non-existent. Most of them were probably some complicated mixture of both, the way that most human beings are. They died because a structure collapsed. They died because the one man who had spent 30 years maintaining that structure was no longer alive to maintain it. And they died because the conditions that had made that structure necessary, the poverty and the exclusion and the neglect that had pushed people into the underground economy in the first place, were not only unchanged, but in many ways were getting worse. Bumpy Johnson's death was not, in the end, the cause of those 40 deaths. It was the trigger. The cause was everything that had come before it. Everything that America had done and refused to do to the community of Harlem over the preceding generations. Bumpy Johnson had been, in his own complicated and deeply flawed way, a response to those conditions. He had been the community's answer to the question of what you do when the legitimate structures of society refuse to recognize your humanity or serve your needs. You build your own structures, and when those structures inevitably fail, or when the person holding them together inevitably dies, you are left with the raw reality of everything those structures were built on top of. There is a final chapter to this story that takes place not in Harlem, but in a federal courtroom. And it is the chapter that most directly connects the world of Bumpy Johnson to the world that followed him. In 1975, Frank Lucas was arrested in a DEA raid on his home in New Jersey. The agents found a large amount of cash, drugs, and documentation that allowed them to begin mapping the full scope of Lucas's operation. The case that followed was extensive, and Lucas ultimately cooperated with federal investigators, providing information that led to the arrest and prosecution of dozens of police officers who had been taking money from the narcotics trade. Some reports suggest that his cooperation contributed to the prosecution of more than 100 people. The cooperation was controversial in Harlem in the extreme. The code that Bumpy Johnson had spent his life enforcing, the absolute prohibition against cooperating with law enforcement, was one of the foundational rules of the world Lucas had operated in. So that Lucas had violated it so openly and so extensively was, to many people in that world, a kind of final desecration of everything Bumpy Johnson had stood for. By the time Lucas was convicted, sentenced, and eventually released, Harlem had changed so dramatically that the world he had helped destroy was almost unrecognizable in its ruins. The crack epidemic of the 1980s had devastated the neighborhood in ways that even the heroin era had not fully managed. Whole city blocks had been hollowed out. The AIDS crisis, which was spreading through intravenous drug use with terrifying efficiency, was killing people who had survived the violence, only to be taken by the disease that rode in on the same needles as the drugs. The political gains of the civil rights era were being reversed by the Reagan administration's systematic defunding of the social programs that had barely begun to address the structural inequalities of black urban life. The 40 men who had died in the streets of Harlem in the 2 years after Bumpy Johnson's funeral were, by the mid-1980s, almost forgotten in the scale of the ongoing catastrophe. They had been the first wave of a flood that showed no signs of receding. So what do we make of all of this? What is the thing we are supposed to take away from the story of Bumpy Johnson's death and the catastrophe that followed it? I think the first thing is this. Institutions matter. Systems of order and hierarchy, even deeply flawed and harmful ones, provide a kind of stability that their absence does not automatically replace with something better. When Bumpy Johnson died, the vacuum he left was not filled by a more just or more humane alternative. It was filled by chaos, and then by a series of increasingly desperate attempts to reimpose order through structures that lacked the specific legitimacy that only Bumpy Johnson had been able to provide. The lesson is not that Bumpy Johnson's world was good. The lesson is that the absence of structure in conditions of poverty and exclusion tends to produce violence, and that communities under stress need institutions, even if those institutions are built informally from below. The second thing is this. The conditions that produced Bumpy Johnson also produced everything that came after him. The redlining, the economic exclusion, the political neglect, the police corruption, the systematic denial of legal opportunity to black Americans in northern cities like New York. All of these things were the real architects of Harlem's tragedy. Bumpy Johnson was a response to those conditions. Frank Lucas was a response to those conditions. Nikki Barnes and his counsel were a response to those conditions. And every young man who picked up a corner in the scramble after Bumpy Johnson's funeral was a response to those conditions. Until those conditions changed, the violence was going to continue, regardless of who was or was not in charge of the streets. The third thing is the most important. And it is the thing that is easiest to lose sight of in a story filled with powerful and charismatic men. The real story of Harlem in the late 1960s and 1970s is not the story of Bumpy Johnson or Frank Lucas or Nikki Barnes. It is the story of the hundreds of thousands of ordinary people who lived in that neighborhood during those years and tried to raise their children, maintain their dignity, and hold their families together while all of this was happening around them. They are the ones whose lives were most directly shaped by the collapse of order after Bumpy Johnson's death. They are the ones who paid the highest price for the conditions that created that collapse. And they are the ones whose resilience and ongoing life in that neighborhood represent the true story of what Harlem is and has always been. Bumpy Johnson died at 62 years old in a soul food restaurant on a hot night in July, eating his favorite meal. He died as he had lived, surrounded by the streets he had spent his entire adult life governing, in the neighborhood that had shaped him and that he, in turn, had shaped in ways both profound and deeply troubling. He was buried at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, and the thousands of people who lined the streets of Harlem to watch his funeral processional were mourning something more than a man. They were mourning a way of life, a set of relationships and structures and understandings that had held their world together through some of the most difficult decades in American history. They knew, even if they could not articulate it precisely in that moment, that what was coming was going to be different, and that different was not going to mean better. They were right. No, the 40 men who died in the 2 years following that funeral were not statistics. They were the first casualties of a world without the specific order that one complicated, brilliant, ruthless, generous, dangerous, and deeply human man had maintained through sheer force of will. They were proof that the peace Bumpy Johnson kept was not a lasting peace, but a borrowed one, held in place by the strength and the reputation and the relationships of one person, and that the moment that person was gone, the borrowed time ran out. The rooftops above Harlem that day were full of police officers with guns, watching and waiting for the violence they knew was coming. What they couldn't have known was the full scale of what was about to unfold, and the years of blood and addiction and loss that would follow from the death of one man in a booth at Wells' restaurant. They could see the crowd below them, the grief and the love, and the complicated mourning of an entire neighborhood saying goodbye to someone who was, simultaneously, the best and worst thing that had ever happened to them. And then the funeral was over. The crowds went home. The buses started running again on Lenox Avenue. And Harlem, which had been holding its breath for 4 days, exhaled. And the war began. If you made it to the end of this video, I want you to think about something. The story of Bumpy Johnson and the violence that followed his death is often told as a gangster's story, as an entertainment, as a kind of dark American mythology populated by larger-than-life characters doing extraordinary things in an extraordinary place. And there is truth in that telling. Because Bumpy Johnson was a larger-than-life character, and the things that happened in Harlem during his life and after his death were extraordinary. But underneath the mythology, there is a much simpler and much more important truth. A community was abandoned by its government, its legal institutions, and its economic system. In that abandonment, the community improvised its own institutions, its own economy, its own governance. Those improvised institutions were imperfect and harmful in ways that compounded the original harm of abandonment. And when those improvised institutions collapsed, the community suffered again, this time from both the original abandonment and the collapse of the imperfect structures it had built. This is not a story that ended in 1970. This is not a story that ended with Nikki Barnes' conviction in 1978, or Frank Lucas's cooperation with federal investigators, or any of the other dramatic events that marked the decade following Bumpy Johnson's death. This is a story that is still being written in communities across America that have been abandoned by the institutions that were supposed to serve them, and have found themselves building the same improvised structures and suffering the same collapses in an ongoing cycle that only changes when the original conditions of abandonment change. Bumpy Johnson is in the ground at Woodlawn Cemetery. The corner of 7th Avenue and 136th Street, where Wells Restaurant once stood, has changed, and the neighborhood has changed. Harlem today is in many ways unrecognizable compared to the Harlem of Bumpy Johnson's time, gentrification having displaced many of the families who lived through the era this video describes. But the questions that his life and death raise have not gone away. What do communities do when the state refuses to serve them? What structures do people build in the absence of legitimate ones? And when those structures collapse, who pays the price? 40 men paid that price in the 2 years after Bumpy Johnson's funeral. Their names deserve to be remembered, even if most of them never will be. Rest in peace to all of them. And to Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, one of the most complicated and consequential figures in the history of New York City, rest in whatever peace a man like that can find. Thank you for watching. And if this story moved you in any way, share it with someone who needs to hear it. There is a lot of history that gets left out of the books, and sometimes the only way it survives is through people like you who care enough to keep it alive. I will see you at the next one.